today's gospel lesson is one that's quite familiar to all of us, I would think. It's a story that's been told in the church from its beginning, obviously, it's part of the Gospel of Luke, but it has a certain resonance, not only in the church, but also in the wider world, the society in which we live. We hear things like this. For example, there has been legislation passed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the title of it is Good Samaritan Law. And the idea behind it is that if someone comes upon someone in straits, someone who's been harmed in some way, and they have the capacity to help them, that they should be willing and able to help them without fear of any kind of lawsuit to follow should something not go the way that everybody intends it to go. If you were a healthcare worker, for example, a nurse or a doctor, people in our litigious society were getting so afraid of lending a helping hand in such a context, that because sometimes if things didn't go well, then they would be sued for damages. What that did, of course, was protect not only the people who offer help, but it also protects us. Because in fact, if I'm in some sort of difficulty and I need help, and everyone is afraid to come and help me, because I might sue them on the other side of things, well, I probably wouldn't get much help. So the idea is to remove that burden, that obstacle from the situation so that people can offer help without that fear. We use the term Good Samaritan in so many other ways, sometimes even in not so positive ways. I have in the back of my head the voice of my father, my dad. When in traffic, for example, somebody would let somebody, he says, "Who does he think he is, the Good Samaritan?" And even here in our own community, our community hospital bears the name, the Good Samaritan Hospital. A hospital being founded by the St. Catherine Guild, the women of this parish, over 100 years ago. And named for a story in the Gospel of Luke. Here we are in the Church of St. Luke the Evangelist, and so it's appropriate that we take a title from that Gospel story, which is the one we read today, that of the Good Samaritan. And other institutions, too. For example, in exercising some modicum of self-care, I frequently visit a counseling center down in Lancaster that specializes in clergy and churches and so on, and its name is the Samaritan Counseling Center. So you see, we use that term most often when we're talking about institutions or situations where someone is in need and someone can find healing and wholeness because of the work of other people. And so there's a great legacy behind this story, particularly in the Christian church and even, as I've mentioned already, into society. And so maybe that story is so familiar to us that it kind of washes over us. Oh, there it is again, that story of the Good Samaritan. We know that story oh so well. And somehow we think what Jesus was trying to do was to teach us to be like the Good Samaritan. And in fact, that's true. I don't want to say that that's not true, because it is deeply true. However, there's much more in this story than we ever really stop to think, because we think we've got the kernel of the story already. But you see, if we know a little bit more about what's going on in this story, maybe there's a little bit more for us to consider. For example, who were the Samaritans? The Samaritans were kind of Jewish, but that was the problem. They were kind of Jewish as far as the people of Judah were concerned. The Samaritans were among the peoples of what we know in biblical history as the northern kingdoms. It was there that people went off the path of the Torah, the law. And so they were sort of put away by God in a sense. They lost their kingdom. We sometimes call them the lost tribes of Israel. If you watch things like Indiana Jones and things like that, you hear about the lost tribes. Well, yeah, they were lost because they lost their kingdom. Part of that was because over time they had intermarried with the pagan cultures around them, and they had adopted some of their own religious practices. And so the people in the south, the people in Judah, gone through several sort of reformations, several revisions, and several sort of rebirths of their religious zeal. They saw these people as half-breeds. They saw these people as other, because they were not pure in their racial identity, and they were not pure in their religious practice. And so they were to be shunned. They were to be avoided, because since they weren't at the tippy top of things, well, they could bring you down. After all, they lost their kingdom. And so the people in the south, people in Judah, were taught for generations that the Samaritans were bad people, and that they were to be avoided, and that they were to be, well, less than respected, shall we say. And so it's interesting that Jesus chooses a Samaritan. It's not the only time we hear about the Samaritans in the Gospels. Even in the Gospel of John, we hear about Jesus talking with the Samaritan woman at the well. And the disciples, you might recall in that story, were amazed because not only was Jesus speaking to a woman, that's bad enough, but he's speaking to a Samaritan woman. So you see, that term was used very negatively in Jesus' time. So for Jesus to use a Samaritan in this story is significant. Now, this man who has come on hard times, the one who has been robbed and beaten within an inch of his life and is in the ditch at the side of the road, more than likely he's Jewish, because it tells us in the story he's coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And that usually means that someone went up to Jerusalem to worship in the temple and they were returning to their home. So this man, most likely a Jew, most likely raised in that context, that culture down in the southern part of that territory where Jesus was ministering, well, he in this story is the one who comes on the hard times. And we hear about the Levite and the priest, and we can talk about those two at some other time. But the important thing today is to think about this Samaritan. You see, we often hear this story and we think about Jesus teaching it, and that somehow Jesus wants us to be like the Good Samaritan. Notice we call him the Good Samaritan as opposed to all those other bad Samaritans. The Good Samaritan. But I'd like you to think about something differently today. Rather than trying to identify with the do-gooder, which was the Good Samaritan, I want you today, for a moment, just for a moment, to identify with the man who is in the ditch. The man who is in the ditch. The one who has been robbed and beaten within an inch of his life. Now, consider this man. This man, from the time he was a small boy, was taught to hate the Samaritans. He was taught that they were dirty people. He was taught that they did not worship properly. In fact, it was the Judahites, the people in the south, who destroyed the temple in the north on Mount Horeb generations before. So there was this blood feud going on between those people and the people, the Jews in the south. Let's see, there's a lot there. Now, this man in the ditch, which I want you to identify with for a moment, he's been taught from the time he was tiny that these are bad people. Now, think of yourself that vulnerable, where you've been robbed and beaten within an inch of your life. You barely have the strength to raise your head or to pick yourself up. And the person you were taught was going to hurt you, was going to harm you, was going to bring you down, was going to just do bad things to you, is coming towards you. How would you feel? Possibly you might think, well, I'm almost dead. I might as well go the whole way now. Keep him away from me. What surprise! The one who was to be hated, the one who was to be pushed to the side, the one who was the least respected among all of those that were along that road that day becomes the one who becomes the instrument of God's compassion, of God's mercy, of God's healing. Think on ourselves. Think on what's going on in our society even today. Think about our own attitudes. Oh, those of us in this church, in this place, probably say, oh no, we're very open, we're very warm, we're very welcoming. We don't really care what color your skin is or where you come from or any of that kind of stuff. Or do we? Because we need to ask ourselves the question that if we were that man in that ditch, what would be our first impulse if this hated one started to come toward us? And if it is that I would rather die than have him help me, then you're revealing that, well, your rather progressive and liberal side isn't all you think it is. We all have biases. We all have prejudices. But Jesus is teaching us a very profound truth here. That God uses all sorts of people and all sorts of circumstances and situations to express his love for us, his love for humanity. That's why in our baptismal promises, which we so glibly say, so easily say when we're in the comfort of our own community, yes, I will seek the face of Christ in all persons, and I will strive for justice and peace, and I will respect the dignity of every human person. But if we're really honest with ourselves, somewhere deep in our hearts there's a except for whomever I've been taught from the time that I was a little one to run away from, to hate, to not accept. If there's even an inkling toward that, then we are still imperfect, which is perfectly natural and perfectly okay. But it does tell us how much we need God's love and grace and compassion. How much we still yet need to grow into, as St. Paul says, the full stature of Christ, where our compassion is that of Jesus, and that not even the Samaritans are worthy of his ire. In fact, he uses them as an example of God's love and mercy. Yeah. This story is more about than just doing good to someone who's hurting. This story challenges us to find in our hearts where we have othered individuals and peoples, where we have rejected people because of who they were, where they came from, what their last name was, what the color of their skin was, what their sexual orientation or gender identity was. No matter what it is, the category that we're choosing, if we hold them up and we push them away, we are the priest and the Levite because we're walking away on the other side. Now, Jesus, to be the Good Samaritan, is not to be the exception to the rule, but rather to be the Samaritan, to be the one who maybe is the half-breed, hasn't seen everything the way that the Orthodox and the righteous see it, but within our own failings and faults, to open our hearts and our minds to the reality that God's love comes through us for all. for all. No exception. Now, this story is why it finds such resonance in the church, I believe. The great motivator to take care of the sick, to bind up the wounds of those who are ill and have gone on hard times. But it's also a clarion call to us to be able to see ourselves as needing the mercy and compassion of our God, because we are as broken as the one in the ditch. And only by that love and compassion and our growth into that full stature of Christ can we find the way forward. So as we look in the world around us and we see so much othering going on, so many comments that say they are them and we should stay away from them, we should get rid of them, we should push them aside. Or we ourselves encounter individuals in our own life, in our own families, where we simply cannot bear them anymore. That we step back, take a breath, and see where our hearts really are. And if they are not where we believe they ought to be, to turn to Christ, who is our healer, who is the source of wholeness and salvation, and seek that grace